They broadcast the surrender of Port Gallowglass like it was a parade. You could hear the clatter of ore carts over the governor's broken microphone, see the Varak syndicate sigil, 9 copper rings around a black pit, stamped across the loading cranes we had built with our own hands. Their marshal announced in a voice that never learned how to pronounce human vowels that the 9/10 rule now applied. 9/10 of everything pulled from the regolith went to Varak, stewardship, 1/10 to the workers for moral maintenance. The camera panned dutifully across the miners' faces and found no tears. Clever camera work. They were past tears. At Brimstone 4, the Helium-3 silos were renamed after Varak founders who died comfortably in staged portraits. At Ilmenite Moon K6, a school was turned into a compliance hall with benches measured to keep spines straight long enough to confess inefficiencies. At the Kepri Belt, our small saints, the tug pilots, the salvage crews, the people who can pull a miracle out of a mismatched bolt and a half-charged cell, disappeared into temporary indenture, which is a lawyer's way of saying bring your own chains. Earth's reply was not a fleet, it was a winter. Ambassador Dara NG stood before a camera in a room with no flag, no seal, just a window on a gray Atlantic. The Varak Syndicate has taken our colonies, she said evenly, and declared our children a rounding error. She lifted a black ledger, paper, not screen. We will answer in a language their accountants understand. We will take their future. The winter doctrine wasn't a plan to burn fields. It was a plan to put spring in the wrong places. Trade lanes we once used obediently went cold, then crooked. Our patented volatiles, our catalytic tricks, our habitat microbes that keep metal bones from catching infections, all of it stopped moving toward Varak. We didn't blockade, we redirected. Ports that had laughed at human bargaining found their docking schedules inverted, their friendly bribes suddenly worth less than a public audit. On Ceres, the nav office printed paper maps like monks, so no accidental updates could erase the truth. In the colonies, we did not organize a glorious last stand. We organized boring survival. Smugglers got lists, not speeches. Who needed insulin, who needed carbon-scrubbing felt, who had a hydroponic system that could hide a library behind a wall of lettuce. A grandmother on Ilmenite Moon K6 taught children to count with bolts and washers, because numbers are a country the conqueror cannot fence. A mechanic at Port Gallowglass showed apprentices how to hand-mill gears in case the syndicate misplaced a printer. We sunk our knowledge deep, into places Varak scanners flagged as low-priority culture storage. Their algorithm had a sense of humor and didn't know it. The Varak Marshal issued a proclamation. All human signage to be replaced by proper glyphs for safety. We obeyed lavishly. Every corridor received Varak glyphs, nested in palimpsests of true directions in the thickness of paint, in the pattern of bolts, in the curvature of handrails. If you were human, you felt the way to the safe room on your palm. If you were not, you collided politely with the wall of your own certainty. History has a drawer for this, occupation procedures. You can itemize them, script, quotas, language reforms, sacrificial ceremonies disguised as audits. But every empire eventually commits the cardinal error. It believes its bookkeeping is a substitute for consent. The Varak called our miners resource vectors, our teachers narrative risk, our chaplains ritual assets. You can love a system to death if you name every person a function. Then the feed from Kepri 12 arrived. A shaky video of 10 Varak compliance advocates conducting a heritage recalibration in a school gym. They had children unlearn Earth's constellations with a clicker and a screen. When you look up, the advocate cooed, you will see the 9 rings first. A small boy raised his hand. My mom says rings are for weddings and thieves. We never learned the boy's name because the video cut out as the advocate reached to take his wrist. You can endure many things, but there is a line where endurance rots into permission. Winter got teeth. NG's second broadcast was shorter. She placed the black ledger on the table and opened it to show 2 columns, taken and owed. The syndicate has seized our hours, our ore, our schools, she said. We will take, by law, by memory, by geometry, their future revenue streams, their officer succession trees, their doctrine of extraction. They will wake up in a museum of their own habits, and their children will be bored there. The first quiet returns began the same week. Ore convoys lost en route to Varak refineries returned to Port Gallowglass with manifests that balanced to the penny, except that the pennies now bought time instead of tithes. Habitat power curves that had been squeezed to anemic lines fattened like winter wolves. A Varak scheduler filed a complaint. Human inefficiencies proliferating. Every miner who read it laughed and sharpened a spade. Humor, too, is a country that cannot be fenced. The Varak Marshal sent a warning. Any attempt to degrade Varak cultural assets will be met with sterilization of non-compliant nodes. He meant it. We read the grammar. We also read the fear. Varak culture was not songs and kitchens and prayers. It was a machine of quotas and rights that made theft feel sacred. That was the thing we aimed to break, not a people. Not a language, a cult of extraction in the clothes of civilization. We wrote the first line in our own ledger. They took our colonies. We will take the calendar they think tomorrow owes them. And somewhere deep in the Kepri belt, a mural painter began sketching a child who looks up at a sky with more than 9 rings. Taking a future begins with planting seeds in soil your enemy mislabels as waste. The syndicate tallied ore and oxygen and calories. We tallied intuitions. On paper, our effort carried 3 prongs. In classrooms and canteens, it had one: teach people to refuse the wrong inevitabilities. The first prong was seed math. The Varak invoices assumed constant yield curves, pleasantly predictable extraction ramps that never met fatigue or sabotage. On Ilmenite Moon K6, our teachers built problem sets from real shafts. If a crew of 7 can hand-mill 3 gears an hour, how many hours until every air recycler can be repaired with no printer? Children solved them with grease under their fingernails. On Brimstone 4, a hydroponics lead taught calculus with algae bloom curves. How do we bend this slope under a random inspection so that the inspector sees what he expects? That knowledge slid into the Varak ledger like a hairline crack under a fresh coat of pride. The second prong was linguistic judo. The syndicate forced a glyph policy on our walls, our labels, our lullabies. We studied their glyphs and discovered that the safety pictograms doubled as status markers. What you were allowed to touch, breathe, become. So we seeded counterglyphs, harmless, compliant, and secretly instructive. A Varak authorized personnel glyph, bent by one stroke, became a map to a blind sensor node. A no idle standing sign, shifted by a millimeter, told a dockhand how long to hum a certain note so a hidden microphone would hear the vibration and open a maintenance panel. Reality obeys physics, not glyphs. Physics was on our side. The third prong was market audit, cleaner than any bomb and harder to sweep. The syndicate's future lay in its contracts. 10-year supply guarantees bound to planetary budgets by clever clauses. We compiled public ledgers of every delivery missed, not just to us, but to the small worlds who wore syndicate silk because the cloth was cheap. We standardized audit packets that a village accountant could run on a chipped tablet. When they found miscounts, they posted, loud, through forums that Varak censors dismissed as low-value chatter. It turned out low-value chatter is where revolutions hide their legs. We did not build this alone. The archivists of tomorrow, a stubborn network of teachers, chaplains, shipwrights, and cooks, wove the doctrine into daily life. Their rule was simple: 1 lesson per day that tastes like food. A kettle boil became a thermodynamics lecture. A lullaby about tides taught orbital phasing. A prayer about dignity doubled as a union charter recited with eyes closed under a camera. Varak compliance reacted with the reflexes of all brittle empires. They punished examples. The boy on Kepri 12 was assigned a vocational reassessment that sent him to Rockfall Camp 18. The supervisor welcomed him with forms as warm as knives. By nightfall, the child had mapped which screws the guards didn't check and which seam in the wall leaked just enough air to carry a whistle code. He slept with his cheek on a bolt and dreamed a song in 9 bars that did not add to 9. We heard the syndicate's culture officers using words like heritage and civilizational stewardship. We used them, too, then pinned them to the board and took them apart. Heritage isn't helmets and quotas. Heritage is kitchens and a grandmother laughing with missing teeth. Stewardship isn't taking 9/10 of breath and calling it civilization. Stewardship is the knowledge of where the spare gasket hides and when the algae tank needs a joke more than a stir. The first quiet collapse happened at Gallo-Glass Line B3 when the ore tally reconciled to 0 because every cart returned for inspection. The exact minute the Verac algorithm predicted a maximally profitable stall. It looked like an accident designed by a poet. The marshal frothed. Our miners shrugged. "We admire your commitment to safety," said the foreman, deadpan, and passed out coffee. But vengeance, hungry and blind, is still blind. We carried a rule like a stone in the pocket. Do not make martyrs, make bored men quit. When Verac tried a public humiliation ritual, Banner Day, where human crews scrubbed the 9 rings into the dust, our crews scrubbed too well. The rings shone like mirrors. Nearby cameras registered glare and shut down to protect their lenses. The ritual produced no footage. A doctrine without an audience starts to smell like the inside of an old helmet, rubber and regret. You could feel the future groaning on its bearings. The syndicate's officer schools doubled their propaganda quotas. We doubled nap time. I mean this literally. Sleep discipline became a tactic. You think better when rested. You plan cleanly when your brain remembers you are loved. We made rooms where a miner could take an hour, no questions, no promises exacted. Revolutions fail for lack of blankets as often as for lack of bullets. "Are we going to shoot?" a young mechanic asked, eyes hard with the earnestness of hurt. "When the math says there's no other way," her mentor answered, "and the ethics say we can live with it." "Who writes the ethics?" "We do, together, every Tuesday at 6. And they did, over soup, over spreadsheets, over a child asleep across 2 chairs. By quarter's end, Verac quarterly reports looked like a fever chart, spikes of rage, valleys of forced calm. The marshal demanded more heritage recalibrations. He got heritage vacancies instead, auditoriums empty except for gullible bureaucrats listening to their own speeches. The archivists of tomorrow wrote a line on a chalkboard no camera could see. A future is a factory that turns children into the right stories. Break the factory, keep the children. When the syndicate finally brought in gunships, it wasn't a surprise. It was an admission. Numbers had refused to worship. Doctrine had lost cameras. You don't send artillery to argue with algebra unless you're fresh out of hymns. We answered with silence nets and malnutrition of violence. The first gunship, Verac Asset 22 Red, banked over Port Gallo-Glass with a compliance script loaded into its outdoor speakers. The script promised sterilization of the non-compliant node if output didn't meet sacred quotas within 36 hours. Our Warden-class cutters, small, ugly ships with souls like terriers, had already seeded the approach with fields tuned to kiss weapon capacitors and drink only the kind of energy that turns children into ash. Asset 22 Red's cannons spun up to glorious rhetoric and exhaled a wheeze so embarrassed you could hear the pilot swear through the glass. Proportion. Ambassador NG reminded our commanders over a narrowband that still smelled of salt air. Hold to proportion like breath. We did not blow ships in half. We made every violent input into a countable output. A Verac frigate tried to jam port communications with heritage hymns. The Orpheus arrays aboard 2 wardens auto-translated the jam into minutes of overtime owed by the syndicate's own contract law and posted the bill with penalties to public forums they had forgotten to censor. You could watch in real time as the frigate's captain received an automated payroll subpoena from his own HR department. He didn't cry. He just stopped shouting. On Brimstone 4, the gunboats attempted a shock audit, barging into habitat rings with scanners and knives for air hoses. We rerouted the ring's spin by 1/4% using nothing but ballast carts and stubbornness. The gunboats found that every straight line in their plan had become a gentle curve. Curves are expensive for bullies. They ruin posture. By nightfall, the gunboats had expended their fuel allocation just staying upright. We offered them a tow. The captain declined with gratitude that sounded like teeth. Were there shots? Yes. In the Mirabelle Caverns, a Varak sergeant fired at a grandmother who refused to kneel before a banner. The bullet hit Aunt Mara's tin kettle. She hit the sergeant with the kettle. We buried the kettle that night with more ritual than any flag has ever earned, then sent the sergeant home wrapped in a report that used syndicate diction to confess syndicate sins. His commander read the prose twice and asked quietly for a transfer to logistics. We liberated Kepri 12 without a single glorious charge. We walked, corridor by corridor, with children knocking on walls to test echoes and miners tapping lids to find which bolts sang out of tune. The recalibration stage that had made our constellations into rings, with its 9 perfect arcs and its little ash bucket by the door, became a kitchen again. We moved the ash bucket beside the stove and used it to catch grease that would otherwise smoke alarms. If you think this is too small for history, you have never cooked in a stolen home and tasted the way a room remembers its name. The syndicate tried a spectacle of return, marching a column of rehabilitated workers through Port Gallo glass beneath banners and drums. We put the names of our dead on our shirts and turned our backs to the parade. Cameras filmed backs, back after back after back. A spectacle is a machine that eats eyes. We fed it refusal and let it choke. By month's end, the syndicate announced cultural territorialization, a granite euphemism for carving our colonies into heritage zones patrolled by priests with clipboards. We convened the equal forum in the open. No flag, no dais, just a corridor held by warden cutters and people who had decided to speak. Spokes from Turval and Kelly Row beamed testimony in from worlds Varak had skimmed for a century. Resolved teams, auditors in heavy boots, presented ledgers. We invited the syndicate to defend its doctrine by showing where, exactly, in its equations consent entered. Their counsel searched for the variable like a man who had misplaced his own first name. "Is this war?" a young pilot asked, watching a gunship struggle like a beetle on its back under light gravity drift. "It's a countersyllabus," her captain said. "They wrote a curriculum where cruelty earns a salary. We're failing the course and replacing the teacher." The first Varak capitulation came not from a marshal but from a merchant, a woman who sold seals and gaskets and had discovered that our audits paid faster than their rituals. She moved her inventory behind our corridors and sent her sons to the Tuesday ethics soup. Her little defection turned a lane. The lane turned a schedule. The schedule turned a quarter. A quarter turns a culture if you stop it from turning children into data. We posted a single line where the Varak could not miss it. "We are not here to take your songs or your kitchens. We are here to end your cult of extraction. Pick which parts you want to keep when it's over." The marshal answered with a threat he could not deliver. We answered with a bedtime story about a kettle and a bullet that missed. He had no answer for a world that sleeps. You cannot bomb a doctrine, you unbuild it, one tool at a time, one Tuesday at a time. We began with calendars. The syndicate's year revolved around banner days and ring feasts, each tied to quota cycles that trained bodies to kneel on schedule. We invited the colonies to keep time by maintenance instead. Filter day, grease day, accounting day, blanket day. Children learned to mark their growth by the things they could repair. Priests blessed wrenches. On blanket day, we closed the docks for an hour in the middle of shift and napped in public under quilts made from old syndicate banners. No one died. Productivity rose. The marshal issued a memo condemning naps as civilizational decay. He sounded like a bad father arguing with a warm bed. Next, language. We outlawed tribute tongues in contracts filed through the equal forum. If your clause could not be explained by a dockhand in a sentence, it didn't bind. Lawyers adapted faster than admirals. The Syndicate's famous 9/10 rule faced a small, fatal question. 9/10 of what? Of ships you didn't build, of breath you didn't grow, of children you didn't carry. When their counsel tried to answer, he found himself speaking in circles that sounded like prayers to a god whose temple was a spreadsheet. We turned symbols. The 9 rings, once carved over every airlock, were recast in recycled nickel as cookware, as wheel bearings, as the bright rims of playground carousels that squealed on purpose so caretakers could hear when joy needed oil. We placed a single surviving plaque in a museum beside Aunt Mara's dented kettle. The placard read, "Exhibit A, Implements of Culture. One taught kneeling, one boiled soup. Guess which one outlived the other?" Then schools. The Syndicate's curriculum taught extraction as destiny and obedience as maturity. We did not burn their books. We reshelved them in the fiction section and wrote new texts that began with consent, reciprocity, and a chapter called Failure Modes of Power. Exams featured practicals. Decrypt this invoice. Fix this valve. Explain why the person in front of you owes you nothing they didn't promise. Children giggled at the last question and grew into citizens who understood that promises are holy because they can be refused. We rewired their succession. Syndicate culture reproduced itself through officer lineage trees, schools feeding billets, feeding marriages, feeding schools. We broke the tree at the root by making duty unattractive to anyone who liked music more than humiliation. Officer canteens served quiet while ours served noise, fiddles, pots, stories. Varak sons and daughters drifted, curious, into Tuesday soup. Some stayed. We were promised empire, a lieutenant said, awed and a little ashamed, and you offered us chores and a chance to laugh. He handed us his badge the same way a boy puts down a stick he'd been told was a sword. We prosecuted the cult without prosecuting the people. Resolved teams walked a doctrine into court, heritage recalibrations, banner days, quota rights. We tried them under laws older than Varak and younger than Earth, laws with names like breath, bread, consent. Verdicts did not send bodies to camps, they sent rituals to the museum. We didn't salt the fields, we salted the scripts. When the marshal finally stood to speak, he did it before a hall that had learned to yawn. He declared a sanctity of Founders' Day and ordered everyone to clap. They clapped. For 8 seconds. Then Filter Day alarms chimed and people went to change the membranes that keep families alive. Later, the only memory anyone could retrieve from Sanctity of Founders was that the membrane clamps stuck on Bay 12 and Luz fixed them with a joke and a wrist. Did we take their art? No, we asked their grandmothers to sing the songs not written by accountants. Many were beautiful, we kept them. Did we erase their gods? No. We asked their priests whether their gods needed 9/10 of our breath to be divine. The good ones said no. The bad ones sulked into side rooms with old banners as blankets. On Kepri 12, the boy from the video, now taller with grease on his cheek, etched a new set of constellations on the gym ceiling. Children lay on their backs and named them. The kettle, the blanket, the wrench, the door that stays open. A Varak child traced the door 3 times with a finger and whispered, "I like this one." We nodded. Futures are doorways that ask to be walked through. We didn't take hers away. We handed it to her. The final surrender did not wear a uniform. It wore a budget. The Syndicate's 10-year projections went transparent under audits they had once called low-value chatter. Investors fled not out of morality but arithmetic. The marshal petitioned for emergency culture grants from a council that had grown tired of invoices with blood in the margins. He received a pamphlet, How to Exit a Cult, authored jointly by minors, chaplains, and a very embarrassed lieutenant. Ambassador NG closed the black ledger and spoke to no camera. "Entry, final," she said softly. "They took our colonies and called it culture. We took their culture of taking and turned it into a museum label. We took their future by giving it to their children instead of their founding myths." Port Gallowglass returned to its old name, which was always home, and the first ship out bore a cargo manifest that made no one kneel to read it. On the gym ceiling, the door that stays open shone, and in the museum, the kettle sat beside the plaque and looked smug as metal can. This is how you take a future, not by stealing it, but by making theft impossible to teach. Continuing with parts 5-8 in the same HFY voice and structure. Varak power did not live in gunmetal, it lived in forecasts, those glossy curves their executives stroked at banquets. Curves are promises drawn in numbers. Break the promise and the empire in the room shrinks to its real size, a handful of worried men with pens. We targeted the forecast engine first. Not with sabotage, with truth. The Equal Forum standardized a public consent coefficient every contract had to carry on its front page. A single value between 0 and 1 measuring whether the people breathing the dust had agreed to the terms, with proofs any child could reproduce with a chalkboard and a bucket of bolts. If the coefficient dropped below 0, 5, forum corridors throttled shipment lanes to maintenance only. If it rose above 0, 7, fees dropped by half. We didn't outlaw extraction. We made extraction without consent cost what it should have cost all along. The Varak Marshal called it warfare dressed as ethics. We called it accounting. On Port Gallowglass, accountants with grease on their sleeves ran the first consent audits in the open. Do you agree? Wasn't asked in some fear-polished office. It was asked in kitchens while Aunt Mara poured tea from the kettle that had once caught a bullet. Every signature got a time voucher stapled to it. An hour per week to nap, pray, laugh, weep, or stare at a wall. Quotas drop when people are treated like people, the marshal wrote, furious. He was wrong. Yield rose because tired hands tremble. We hit the derivatives next. The syndicate's future sold to itself in elaborate origami. Our warden cutters projected open tickers into the sky you could read with binoculars. Delivery on Brimstone Helium-3. Spot and 3-month, consent adjusted. Prices stopped obeying the priesthood. A Varak trader tried to scream manipulation. A miner with a wrench raised an eyebrow and said, "We're manipulating with consent, try it sometime." The first crack sounded at Kepri Bank West when an internal memo leaked. Reputational risk of banner days now exceeds compliance benefit. Consider ceremonial pause. The memo had a watermark, Leth Sora, senior auditor. We expected a purge. We got a message. I can't find consent anywhere in the lineage trees. I was told it was in the footnotes. We smuggled Leth Sora out under a blanket that smelled of stew, hid him in a canteen, and watched a story begin to kneel to arithmetic. Varak tried to restore the old glamour with a showpiece. The 10th Tithe March, officers in polished copper, drums tuned to instinct, 9 rings cut into the dust with compasses so sharp they scratched pride into the planet. We scheduled Open Books Day the same hour. Families brought ledgers to the square. Children read numbers into the air, out loud, with the shamelessness of truth. 9/10 of last month's was ours, a girl said, tapping a column with a bitten pencil, because we agreed to fix the east pump and you didn't. Cameras caught a city leaning toward a child with a pencil. The march threw its shadow and found no eyes to eat. The marshal had one weapon left. Red winter, close ports, freeze wages, make people hungry enough to forget ethics for bread. NG answered with a map. The boring artery, a loop of maintenance-only corridors guarded by titans far away and wardens up close, where ships moved slowly, predictably with manifests so dull the soul ached. And every crate contained medicines, socks, grease, lessons on how to ask the right questions. Varak raiders came once, met silence nets that tasted like a library's hush, and limped home discovering their fuel budgets had been transparently billed to their own officers by their own contracts. The Equal Forum adopted the museum charter, fast as wisdom allows, any ritual or policy with a consent coefficient under 0. 4 would be deconsecrated, removed from power and placed, intact in a museum labeled with its own math. Banner days, heritage recalibration, 9/10 rule. The charter did not ban song or language or kitchen. It banned theft dressed as heritage. Leth Sora took the stand in a corridor so quiet you could hear the tick of the kettle's dented side cooling. I was raised to honor founders, he said, hands shaking. My first memory is a ring cut in wet sand, but I can no longer find a line item called breath in the budgets. I can no longer sign what I cannot find. He placed a copper ring on the table and with an accountant's precise disgust, flattened it with a hammer until it looked like a spoon. The revenue curves did not crash. They descended into reason. No empire dies all at once. It dies the way bad math does, line by line, confessed to by the very men who worshipped it when the proofs stopped loving them back. By quarter's end, the marshal's forecasts had grown so shrill the axes looked like threats. NG's ledger had room for one more line in that chapter. We did not starve them. We made their future edible by the people who had to live there. And in a corner of the gym on Kepri 12, a Varak child traced the door that stays open and whispered to a human friend, "My father says the future has gone missing." The boy pointed at the chalkboard. "We didn't make it missing," he said gently. "We made it ours." A culture is more than costumes. It is the story it tells about permission. We brought the story to trial. The Equal Forum convened a hearing with a name long enough to break on the tongue. The indictment of the Nine, a case against rituals that claim without consent. No dais, no spotlights, a corridor under warden guard, benches of mismatched chairs, a kettle on a table. The indictment listed practices, not people. Banner days, heritage recalibration, quota service, founder's sanctity, compliance marches, officer lineage trees, tribute tongues, 10th tithe, and silencing of ledgers. Each line ended in a question: where does consent enter? Witnesses crossed the threshold like pilgrims to an ordinary room. A Varak grandmother, wrists tattooed with kitchen tongs, testified first. "My mother taught me a harvest song in a language without glyphs," she said, voice dry as old bread. "When the rings came, our priest said the song made the pumps run better, so we sang while we bent." She looked at the rings recast as cookware stacked on a shelf. "A song is a leash if someone else gets to yank it." A heritage advocate took the next seat, crisp as doctrine. He spoke of unity, of belonging, of duties to the dead. Leth Sora, now pale but unafraid, laid a ledger beside him. "This is your budget for Founder's Sanctity," he said, fingertip on the line. "Here is where you buy cameras and copper polish. Here are the earmarks for compliance drums. Here is collateral management for sterilization strikes. Here is no line for consent. Show me the variable, I will withdraw." The advocate opened his mouth, then closed it, not in defeat, but in a long, unfamiliar taste, honesty. "I can't," he said finally, very small. We did not cheer. We reshelved. The forum voted to deconsecrate 6 of the 9, sending them not to oblivion but to the museum's loud room, where visitors could beat the drums and polish the copper and then read a plaque. These were rituals that demanded kneeling. Here is what happened when the kneeling stopped. The remaining 3, the kitchen songs, the language of grandparents, the feast days that truly belonged to homes, were returned to the people with a statement that made the room exhale. No ritual may claim more than the consent it can measure. Marshal Serev Var entered like a statue someone had taught to walk. We did not put him in a cage. We handed him a chair. "You commanded policies that turned breath into tithe," Alina NG said, voice even. "Under the charter, you owe repair." He waited for a number large enough to make a martyr. We gave him work. The museum charter required curators who knew the seduction of banners intimately. He would catalog the cult he had fed, write captions that confess the trick, host schoolchildren, and answer questions that start with "Why did you?" There are punishments more searing than a cell. Explaining yourself forever is one. He tried a speech. The kettle's whistle interrupted him. People laughed, not cruelly, like a room that has better things to do. He signed the acceptance of his sentence with the hand that once signed sterilizations. It shook. Good. Hands should shake when they write history. Justice for individuals followed the same logic. Repair, not revenge. A sergeant who ordered a recalibration on Kepri 12 spent a year restoring constellations with the boy from the video. A compliance pilot whose cannon misfired into dignity learned to lead Blanket Day, folding quilts beneath the same banners he once paraded, now cut into squares that warmed sleeping children. Those who refused any part of repair, the corridors did not welcome them. They left, their boots loud on metal that no longer belonged to their stride. We addressed one last ritual, silencing of ledgers. The forum's final decree was the plainest: all budgets public, all audits copyable, all minutes recorded in kitchen language before they are filed in priestly speech. A bureaucracy is a ritual with paperwork. Sunlight turns it into a calendar. On Port Gallowglass, a blackboard appeared in the square. We spent grease, blankets, tea, hours. We owe apologies, new hinges, 3 lullabies. I have never loved a balance sheet more. When the verdicts ended, the rings on our playground squealed because someone pushed too hard and the bearing needed oil. 10 children leapt to fix it. The marshal watched them with an expression that had never been taught to his face. It might have been hope. It might have been grief for a life spent polishing copper while kitchens went hungry. We entered a new line in the ledger NG kept under her palm. The 9 stood up in formal clothes. We asked them their names. 6 admitted they were theft and put on museum tags. 3 went home and made soup. Victories come on drums. Civilization arrives in chores. We aimed our genius not at monuments, but at maintenance. The first convoy through the boring artery after the hearing carried no heroes, just gaskets, pen nibs, school slates, mothballed sensors, seed packets labeled in a dozen scripts. Warden cutters bracketed the line, engines humming with the lazy confidence of workboats. On the hulls, children had painted the constellations from the gym. The kettle, the blanket, the wrench, the door that stays open. No banners, no rings. When a camera drone swooped close, a pilot stuck a handwritten note to the glass. "We are busy." Calendars hardened into habits. Filter day meant jokes about membranes and a song about not leaving tools in pockets. Grease day taught angles to elbows. Accounting day meant cookies in the square while line items were read aloud until every child could recite breath, bread, blanket without blushing. On blanket day, even the proudest foreman lay down. The marshal, now curator VAR, once tried to skip his nap and lecture schoolchildren about founders. A grandmother handed him a quilt. He slept, snoring like a contrite baritone. The class wrote a poem about it on a blackboard and then balanced the snack ledger. Language flowers when you stop watering it with fear. Varak kitchens resurrected recipes their grandmothers had whispered behind banners. Human canteens learned to steam spiced starch properly so it didn't sulk. Chaplains and priests traded rights like seeds, each labeling the packet. Grow in shade, likes laughter, dies if forced. The tribute tongue that clipped formal register for invoices and insults shrunk to its proper size, a tool, not a throne. Schools rewired ambition. The old exams had rewarded obedience to curves and quotas. The new ones proctored repair. A perfect score was not a number. It was a hinge that didn't squeal, a patient valve, a contract explained in one breath to a 9-year-old who asked, "Why?" twice. We abolished the title officer and invented steward, a word that tastes better when said with soup in your mouth. The salary was measured in hours you could give away without asking permission. Markets adjusted the way trees adjust to light. The future exchange, born from warden tickers, made consent-adjusted contracts fashionable. Want 10,000 tons of helium-3. Post your consent coefficient and your Tuesday soup plan. What you feed when you nap, how many blankets you'll buy. Traders laughed until they noticed lower spoilage and fewer riots turn into profit. We did not apologize for teaching capitalism to count what it pretended was a rounding error. We rebuilt memory on purpose. The museum's loud room, drums, banners, compliance clipboards, sat beside the quiet room where Aunt Mara's kettle lived, dent and all, with a plaque that asked visitors to trace the rim with a finger and then describe someone they loved who deserved hot tea. Curator VAR learned to answer hard questions without flinching. Some days he failed. Those were good days, too. Not everyone came quietly to boring peace. A Varak splinter tried to resurrect the rings with a glamorous pilgrim march. The corridor stared at them with the unglamorous power of geometry. Silence nets made speeches sound like nostalgia. The Equal Forum posted open signing hours that overlapped the march and paid double time for story collection. The pilgrims found themselves interviewed by teenagers with clipboards and cookies. Half signed away their banners for steward apprenticeships. The other half kept walking and discovered the corridor only leads to doors, never to altars. And that boy from Kepri 12. He became an auditor of the sky, chalk-dusted and solemn, carrying a wooden meter stick like a scepter. His first decree measured playground bearings by giggle per minute and allocated grease accordingly. His second banned glorious speeches anywhere near nap mats. "It's a safety hazard," he said gravely. "People trip over adjectives." On Port Gallo glass, a Varak child, yes, the one who traced the door, stood in the square and hesitated. "May we keep our kitchens the way my grandmother does?" she asked. "Even if the recipes sing the old songs." Aunt Mara nodded. "Sing," she said. "But if a song asks someone else to kneel, put it in the museum and bring it cookies once a year through the glass." We didn't draft a constitution that day. We taped a notice to the canteen wall. "The future will be measured on Tuesdays at 6 over soup. Bring ledgers, bring jokes, bring blankets." The Titans far away idled their fields like mountains that had learned to hum lullabies. The wardens patrolled, bored and proud. Boredom is underrated. Boredom is a civilization refusing to perform its own fragility for cameras. We called it peace and meant it. NG opened the black ledger one last time beside a window with the Atlantic gray behind it, the way this had begun. Pages already carried entries written in kitchen script. Took, owed, returned. She didn't reach for a trumpet. She reached for a pen that left tiny ridges the finger could feel, history you can touch. "Final entries," she said, "for the record none of us will ever let be lost. 1. They took our colonies with a cult of extraction. We took their future of taking by making it pay the price it always hid. 2. We dismantled rituals that demanded kneeling and gave them to the museum. 3. We returned songs and kitchens to the people who owned them. 4. We measured consent and never stopped. Someone asked if we had destroyed Varak culture. NG shook her head. We destroyed a machine that pretended to be one. Curator Var stood in the museum's loud room facing 30 children and 2 journalists who had arrived late on purpose. He held a copper ring and a wooden spoon. "One teaches you to march," he said, tapping the ring. "One teaches you to stir." He placed both on the table and stepped back. A child picked up the spoon to drum on the ring. Another laughed. The curator did not scold. He wrote a new caption. "Things are complicated and that's fine." On Kepri 12, the gym ceiling glowed with constellations. The kettle, the blanket, the wrench, the door that stays open. A new shape joined them, drawn by a child with a careful hand and a Varak accent softened by soup. The ledger, a rectangle turned slightly askew like a book that has been read. "It's for remembering," she explained, "so we don't have to get loud again." The boy who once mouthed off during heritage recalibration stood at the Yule Forum's kitchen counter, taller, shoulders squared by sleep, stirring a pot with exaggerated dignity. "Adjourned," he declared when the soup was done. He banged the kettle with a ladle. The clang sang like a star heard through tin. Across the colonies, the consent coefficient got boringly high. Our warden tickers marked contract renewals with little asterisks that meant nap clauses improved. Traders took pride in adding them. Addicts of glory grumbled that we had turned struggle into municipal service. They were right. That was the point. We left some things deliberately unfinished. The museum's quiet room keeps one empty shelf for the next ritual some future clever thief will invent. The forum's rules include a line that reads, "If a child says stop, stop." There is no footnote. The ledger has blank pages clipped to the back with a clothespin that smells vaguely of soap. You cannot make a system immune to theft. You can make it allergic. The Titans, far away, patient as weather, received no parade. Mnemosyne archived, Aegis watched, Atlas kept lanes that made sense. If you listen hard enough at shift change, you can hear them hum the names of our dead not as a dirge but as instructions. Remember first, act second. The last banner came down not by decree, but because it made a poor quilt. Aunt Mara cut it, fingers sure, tongue between her teeth, humming the harvest song she had sworn would never again be commanded by anyone. She sewed the quilt's corner to a frayed square from a warden cutter and a patch cut from a Varak priest's apron. She held it up to the light. "Warm," she said, "and interesting." NG closed the ledger and slid it onto a shelf beside cookbooks, hymnals, maintenance manuals. She wrote on the spine in block letters a child could read, what we owe each other when we dig. Did we take their future? We took it out of the hands of men who counted breath as a tithe and put it back where futures belong. In kitchens and canteens, in ledgers read aloud on Tuesdays, in the small, relentless arithmetic of people who have decided their children will not have to kneel before numbers ever again. That night on Port Gallo glass, wind rattled a window left open for luck. In the square, a plaque beneath Aunt Mara's kettle reflected starlight and a smear of soup. Children ran in circles until the bearings squealed, joy needing oil. 10 grown-ups moved without being told, hands already greasy, tired, content. Far above, the constellations drew lines so clean even accountants smiled. The door that stays open pointed toward a set of coordinates called tomorrow. We did not steal it. We stewarded it together.